"What is that around your neck?" The words escaped Rashid al-Khalil's lips in a strangled whisper, as his eyes locked onto the distinctive medallion hanging from his daughter's boyfriend's chain, a piece of jewelry that had haunted his nightmares for 37 years. The young black man, standing confidently in his marble foyer, shifted uncomfortably under the intensity of his gaze, one hand instinctively moving to protect the silver pendant that gleamed against his dark skin like a beacon from the past. Yasmin looked between her father and Marcus with growing confusion, unaware that the simple family heirloom her boyfriend wore so casually was about to unravel secrets that would destroy everything she thought she knew about her family's history and her father's carefully constructed empire of lies. The Al-Khalil mansion rose from Dubai's most exclusive district like a monument to oil, wealth and political influence, its white limestone facade and towering columns designed to intimidate visitors while broadcasting the family's status to anyone who dared approach its gates. Inside, Italian marble floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers that had been imported from European palaces, while Persian rugs worth more than most houses provided softness beneath the feet of those wealthy enough to walk these halls. Every surface spoke of money accumulated over generations, each artifact carefully chosen to demonstrate sophistication and power that few families in the region could match. Rashid al-Khalil commanded this empire from his study, a room lined with first-edition books and ancient manuscripts that served as the nerve center for business operations spanning 3 continents. At 62, he was still considered one of the most formidable men in Middle Eastern commerce, his influence extending from oil fields in the desert to technology investments in Silicon Valley. His success had been built on calculated risks and strategic partnerships, but also on secrets that he had buried so deeply that even his own family had no knowledge of the foundations upon which their fortune truly rested. The man who sat behind the massive mahogany desk each morning was different from the one who had arrived in Dubai 40 years earlier as a young refugee fleeing civil war in his homeland. That earlier version of himself had been desperate and hungry, willing to do whatever was necessary to survive in a foreign land where opportunities were scarce and competition was fierce. The transformation from refugee to millionaire was a story he had never told his children, a journey that included chapters so dark that acknowledging them would have destroyed everything he had worked to build for his family. Yasmin al-Khalil had grown up in this world of privilege, without ever questioning how it had come to exist. Her 24 years, shaped by private schools, European universities, and social circles where wealth was assumed rather than earned. She possessed her father's intelligence and determination, but had applied these gifts to humanitarian work rather than business expansion, her idealism intact because she had never been forced to compromise her values for survival. Her work with refugee organizations brought her into contact with people whose struggles reminded her of stories her grandmother had told about earlier generations, though she had never connected these tales to her own family's history. The relationship with Marcus Thompson had begun 6 months earlier at a charity gala, where both were volunteering their time to support educational initiatives in underprivileged communities. He had impressed her immediately with his combination of intellectual depth and genuine compassion, his presence commanding attention in any room despite his modest background and lack of inherited advantages. Their connection had grown steadily stronger as they discovered shared values and complementary perspectives on social justice issues that mattered deeply to both of them. Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity that came from overcoming obstacles through personal excellence rather than inherited privilege. At 26, he had already established himself as one of the most promising young lawyers in London's human rights community, his work on behalf of asylum seekers and displaced persons earning recognition from organizations across Europe. His success was particularly remarkable given his background as the son of Somali immigrants who had arrived in Britain with nothing but determination and faith that education could transform their family's circumstances. The necklace that had caught Rashid's attention was the only physical connection Marcus maintained to his grandfather, a man who had died when Marcus was 12, but whose influence had shaped every important decision in his life thereafter. The silver medallion bore intricate engravings that told the story of a family's journey across continents, symbols that connected present success to ancestral wisdom while serving as a reminder of sacrifices made by previous generations. Marcus wore it not as decoration, but as a talisman that kept him grounded in his values, even as his professional achievements opened doors to increasingly elite circles. The casual dinner invitation that brought Marcus to the Al-Khalil mansion had been Yasmin's attempt to bridge the growing distance between her personal life and family obligations. She had been avoiding introducing him to her father for months, not because she was ashamed of either man, but because she understood that their different backgrounds and perspectives might create tensions that could complicate her relationships with both of them. Her father's traditional views about appropriate partners for his daughter had been expressed subtly but consistently throughout her adult life. The evening had begun pleasantly enough, with Marcus demonstrating the social graces that had served him well in professional settings, where he regularly interacted with judges, politicians, and business leaders, despite his humble origins. His conversation revealed both intelligence and cultural sophistication, while his respectful demeanor toward Yasmin and her family showed the kind of character that should have impressed any reasonable parent. The dinner proceeded smoothly through several courses, with discussions ranging from current events to cultural observations that showcased Marcus's education and worldliness. But everything changed when Marcus removed his jacket in the warm evening air, revealing the necklace that he had worn hidden beneath his formal shirt throughout the meal. The silver medallion caught the light from the dining room's chandelier as it settled against his chest, its distinctive design suddenly visible to everyone at the table. Yasmin noticed her father's reaction immediately, the way his face drained of color and his hands began trembling as he stared at the jewelry with an expression that mixed recognition with something approaching terror. The silence that followed Rashid's strangled question stretched across the dining room like a physical presence, heavy with implications that none of them yet understood. Marcus's instinctive movement to protect the necklace revealed his awareness that something significant was happening, though he had no context for understanding why a simple family heirloom could provoke such an intense reaction from his girlfriend's father. Yasmin's confusion was evident in her expression as she looked between the two men, sensing that she was witnessing something important but lacking the information necessary to interpret what was unfolding before her. The medallion itself was approximately 2 inches in diameter, crafted from silver that had been worked by master artisans whose techniques had been passed down through generations of Somali metalworkers. Its surface bore intricate patterns that told stories of migration and survival, symbols that connected contemporary struggles to ancient traditions of resilience and community solidarity. To most observers, it would have appeared to be simply an attractive piece of ethnic jewelry, valuable for its craftsmanship, but not particularly remarkable in its design or significance. But to Rashid Al-Khalil, the necklace represented evidence of crimes he had committed nearly 4 decades earlier, when desperation and opportunity had combined to create choices that haunted him, despite the wealth and success they had ultimately generated. The medallion was not just jewelry, but proof of identity, a marker that connected its wearer to specific families and tribal affiliations that Rashid had hoped would remain buried in the chaos of civil war and refugee displacement. Seeing it around Marcus's neck was like encountering a ghost from a past he had spent his entire adult life trying to escape. The story that began emerging through Rashid's reluctant questioning painted a picture of connections that defied probability, while explaining coincidences that had seemed meaningless until this moment of recognition. Marcus's grandfather had been named Ahmed Thompson, a Somali elder who had fled his homeland during the same period when Rashid had made his own desperate journey to safety in the Gulf states. The timing and circumstances of their parallel migrations had brought them into contact during the most dangerous phase of Rashid's transformation, from refugee to businessman, a period when survival had required moral compromises that successful people preferred to forget. The refugee camps of the 1980s had been places where normal rules of civilized behavior were suspended by desperation and opportunity, where people with nothing to lose made alliances and enemies based on immediate necessity rather than long-term consequences. Rashid had arrived with nothing but intelligence and ambition, while Ahmed Thompson had possessed something far more valuable in those circumstances: information about safe routes and reliable contacts that could mean the difference between successful escape and death in the desert between borders. The partnership that developed between the two men had been born of mutual need rather than friendship or shared values. Ahmed possessed knowledge and connections that Rashid required for his planned journey to the Gulf, while Rashid offered payment and protection that could help Ahmed's own family reach safety in refugee camps that were better supplied and more secure than the makeshift settlements where they had initially found shelter. Their arrangement was supposed to be temporary and mutually beneficial, a business transaction that would allow both families to survive and eventually prosper in their new circumstances. But Rashid's desperation had made him willing to consider options that Ahmed would never have approved, shortcuts that involved betraying the trust of people who had helped them both reach temporary safety. When an opportunity arose to secure passage and documentation through means that required sacrificing other refugees to authorities who were hunting displaced persons, Rashid had made calculations that prioritized his own family's survival over broader moral considerations. The decision had been rationalized as necessary pragmatism, but its consequences had extended far beyond his own circumstances. The betrayal that followed had been systematic and devastating, with Rashid providing information to authorities that resulted in the arrest and deportation of dozens of refugees who had trusted him with their locations and plans. Among those who disappeared in the raids that followed, his cooperation was Ahmed Thompson, who had been seized, along with several other family members, while attempting to guide a group of women and children to safety across a border that Rashid had assured them was unguarded and secure. The medallion that Marcus now wore had been among the personal effects that Rashid had been asked to safeguard, while Ahmed led the dangerous border crossing, valuable items that families entrusted to those remaining behind, in case the journey ended in capture or death. When the raids occurred, and Ahmed failed to return, Rashid had been left with jewelry and documents belonging to people who were now dead or imprisoned, evidence of trust that had been betrayed for the chance to secure his own family's passage to prosperity and safety. The guilt that had accompanied Rashid's subsequent success had been manageable as long as the victims of his betrayal remained abstract figures from a distant past, nameless casualties of circumstances that had forced impossible choices on everyone involved. Building a fortune through legitimate business activities had provided psychological distance from the moral compromises that had made survival possible, while the passage of time had allowed him to reframe those early decisions as unfortunate necessities rather than conscious betrayals of people who had trusted him. But Marcus's presence in his home, wearing evidence of that betrayal around his neck like an accusation, made denial impossible while threatening to expose secrets that could destroy everything Rashid had built for his family. The young man's resemblance to Ahmed Thompson was unmistakable once Rashid allowed himself to see it. The same intelligent eyes and determined jawline that had made the elder Thompson such an effective leader among the displaced families seeking safety and new opportunities in foreign lands. The revelation that Marcus was Ahmed's grandson created implications that extended far beyond personal guilt to threaten the legal foundations of Rashid's business empire. Much of his initial capital had come from selling artifacts and jewelry that had been entrusted to his safekeeping by families who had subsequently disappeared, valuable items that he had claimed as abandoned property when no one survived to reclaim them. The documentation and provenance records that supported his ownership of these assets were fraudulent, created to legitimize possession of property that legally belonged to the estates of murdered or displaced persons. More devastating than the potential legal consequences was the moral reckoning that Marcus's presence demanded, forcing Rashid to confront the human cost of choices that had seemed abstract and distant for nearly 4 decades. The successful lawyer who stood in his dining room represented not just Ahmed Thompson's legacy, but the potential that had been destroyed when Rashid's betrayal had eliminated an entire generation of community leaders who might have guided their people's successful integration into European and Middle Eastern societies. The conversation that followed Rashid's recognition of the medallion was halting and painful, with each revelation creating new layers of horror and understanding that transformed the evening from casual family dinner to confrontation with historical trauma that had shaped multiple generations. Marcus's questions about his grandfather's fate were answered with reluctant honesty that revealed not just individual betrayal, but systematic exploitation of refugee communities by people who had shared their circumstances, struggles. Yasmin's reaction to learning about her father's past was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire revelation. Her idealistic worldview shattered by understanding that her privileged lifestyle had been built on the suffering of people whose causes she had spent her adult life supporting. The family fortune that had funded her education and humanitarian work had originated from betraying the very communities she now sought to help, creating ironies that made her professional accomplishments feel like unconscious mockery of her grandfather's victims. The legal implications of Rashid's crimes began emerging as Marcus applied his professional expertise to analyzing the evidence that his mere presence had uncovered. Statutes of limitations might protect against prosecution for the original betrayals, but the ongoing possession of stolen property and the fraudulent documentation used to legitimize business transactions created contemporary crimes that remained prosecutable under multiple jurisdictions. The revelation threatened not just Rashid's reputation but his freedom and his family's financial security. But Marcus's response to learning about his grandfather's fate revealed character depths that neither Rashid nor Yasmin had anticipated, moral sophistication that transcended simple demands for justice or revenge. Rather than seeking to destroy the family that had benefited from his grandfather's murder, Marcus proposed a different kind of reckoning that could acknowledge historical wrongs while creating positive outcomes for communities that continued to suffer from displacement and persecution. The foundation that eventually emerged from their negotiations became a model for how historical trauma could be addressed through restorative rather than purely punitive justice, with Rashid's wealth redirected towards supporting refugee communities and asylum seekers, whose struggles echoed those that had been betrayed by his younger self. The legal structures that protected him from prosecution were maintained, but his moral obligations were acknowledged through systematic efforts to repair damage that extended far beyond individual crimes to encompass broader patterns of exploitation and abandonment. Yasmin's role in these developments was perhaps the most complex, as she struggled to reconcile love for her father with horror at his past, while maintaining her relationship with Marcus despite the impossible circumstances that connected their families. Her decision to continue working with refugee communities while openly acknowledging her family's complicity in historical crimes created a model for how privilege could be transformed into responsibility rather than simply abandoned or denied. The transformation of the Al-Khalil family's public image from successful immigrants to acknowledged participants in historical trauma was gradual but ultimately complete, with Rashid's business empire restructured to prioritize social impact over pure profit maximization. The medallion that had triggered these revelations was returned to Marcus's family, along with other artifacts that had been held for decades, while the documentation of Rashid's crimes was preserved as historical record rather than destroyed to protect his reputation. The marriage that eventually united Yasmin and Marcus was conducted with full knowledge of the historical complexities that connected their families, their union serving as a symbol of how love could transcend even the most difficult inherited circumstances. The ceremony included traditions from both cultures, while acknowledging the pain that had shaped their paths toward each other, creating space for grief and celebration that honored both their ancestors' struggles and their own hopes for the future. The charitable work that became the focus of their shared life was informed by deep understanding of how privilege and suffering were often connected in ways that comfortable people preferred to ignore, their efforts directed toward creating systemic changes that could prevent future generations from facing the impossible choices that had shaped their families' histories. The foundation they established became a model for how wealth could be transformed from evidence of historical crimes into tools for contemporary justice. Years later, when Marcus looked at the medallion that had changed everything, he understood that his grandfather's legacy lived not in the silver symbols of his identity, but in the courage and wisdom that had been passed down through stories and values rather than material possessions. The necklace had served its purpose by revealing truth that needed acknowledgement, but the real inheritance was the moral clarity that helped his generation make better choices than their predecessors had been able to manage under circumstances of desperation and limited options. The investigation that Marcus launched into his family's history uncovered additional layers of betrayal that extended far beyond his grandfather's individual case, revealing systematic patterns of exploitation that had affected entire communities of displaced persons during the chaotic period following regional conflicts. Documents preserved in international archives showed that Rashid's cooperation with authorities had enabled raids that captured hundreds of refugees, many of whom had subsequently disappeared into detention systems that kept no reliable records of their fates or final destinations. The scope of these revelations transformed what had initially seemed like an individual crime into evidence of broader complicity in what international legal experts began recognizing as crimes against humanity. Rashid's role had been more extensive than even he had initially admitted, his information and assistance enabling systematic roundups that had effectively destroyed entire extended family networks and community structures that refugees had been attempting to recreate in their new environments. The discovery of additional medallions and artifacts in Rashid's private collection provided physical evidence that supported Marcus's growing understanding of how thoroughly his grandfather's generation had been betrayed by people they had trusted as allies and fellow victims. Each piece of jewelry and personal documentation told stories of families who had entrusted their most precious possessions to someone they believed would safeguard their heritage, while they risked dangerous journeys towards safety and new opportunities. The psychological impact of these discoveries on Rashid was profound and increasingly visible, his carefully controlled demeanor cracking under the weight of confronting the full scope of crimes that he had spent decades rationalizing as unfortunate necessities. The successful businessman who had commanded respect throughout the Middle Eastern financial community was revealed to be someone whose entire identity had been constructed around denial of moral responsibilities that he could no longer avoid acknowledging. His attempts to justify his past actions by citing the desperate circumstances that had forced impossible choices were systematically dismantled by Marcus's methodical analysis of available options and alternative courses of action that had been rejected in favor of betrayal and self-preservation. The legal training that Marcus applied to examining historical evidence revealed that Rashid's choices had been driven more by greed and ambition than by genuine necessity, his cooperation with authorities extending far beyond what survival had actually required. The impact on Yasmin's understanding of her own identity was equally devastating as she began recognizing how her privileged worldview had been shaped by systematic ignorance of the suffering that had funded her comfortable lifestyle. Her work with humanitarian organizations took on new meaning as she realized that she had been unconsciously working to help people whose circumstances paralleled those of her father's victims, her charitable efforts serving as unconscious penance for crimes she had never known her family had committed. The social consequences that followed the revelation of these historical connections created ripple effects throughout Dubai's elite community, as other wealthy families began questioning the origins of their own fortunes and the possibility that their success might also be built on hidden crimes and betrayals. The comfortable narratives that supported the region's business establishment were challenged by growing awareness that refugee displacement and economic opportunity had often been connected in ways that successful people preferred not to examine too closely. The media attention that eventually surrounded their story created international discussions about historical accountability and the responsibilities of inherited wealth, with legal scholars and human rights advocates using their case as an example of how past crimes continued affecting contemporary circumstances through intergenerational transmission of both trauma and advantage. The foundation they established became a model that was studied and replicated by other organizations, seeking to address historical injustices through systematic redistribution of resources and opportunities. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing to this channel. Now, back to the story. The evening that had begun as a simple family dinner had become a reckoning with history that transformed everyone involved, proving that the past was never truly buried as long as its consequences continued shaping contemporary circumstances. The medallion had been a key that unlocked secrets, but the real revelation was that healing was possible when people chose truth over comfort and justice over convenience, even when these choices required sacrificing advantages that had been built on others' suffering. The story of their families became a reminder that individual success was always connected to broader historical patterns, that privilege carried responsibilities that extended beyond personal enjoyment to encompass moral obligations toward those whose sacrifices had made contemporary opportunities possible. The necklace that had seemed like simple jewelry had actually been evidence of connections that demanded acknowledgement, healing, and transformation rather than denial or destruction. In the end, Marcus's grandfather had achieved a victory that transcended his own survival, his medallion serving as a messenger that ensured his betrayal would eventually be acknowledged, and his sacrifice would contribute to positive changes that honored his memory, while protecting future generations from similar exploitation. The silver pendant that had traveled across decades and continents had fulfilled its purpose by bringing truth to light and creating opportunities for justice that restored dignity to those who had been wronged while offering redemption to those who had inherited the benefits of historical crimes.